When Boston socialite Victoria Blackwood flees west after witnessing her federal judge father's murder, the last thing she expects is to be rejected as a mail-order bride for being too refined. But Sheriff Ethan Stone isn't just any small-town lawman. He's a former Pinkerton agent working undercover to expose the same criminal network that killed her father. As Victoria hides her true identity while dangerous men close in from the east, she discovers that the man she's falling for might be the only person who can protect her, or the one person she can never trust. This is a story of hidden identities, deadly secrets, and a love that could either save them both or destroy everything they're fighting to protect. If you love romantic suspense with strong heroines and mysterious heroes, don't forget to like and subscribe for more thrilling Western adventures. You're not safe here. Judge's daughter hides in Colorado. Sheriff's secret changes everything. The stagecoach wheezed to a stop in front of the Silver Peak Depot like an old man finally reaching his destination. Through the dust-covered window, Victoria Blackwood studied the Colorado mining town that was supposed to be her salvation, her heart sinking with each detail she absorbed. This was nothing like the genteel Boston streets she'd known all her life. Silver Peak looked exactly like what it was, a rough frontier settlement built around the promise of silver and sustained by the determination of men who had nowhere else to go, perfect for someone who needed to disappear. Victoria adjusted the simple brown dress she'd purchased in Denver, so different from the silk gowns that filled her abandoned wardrobes back east. The rough fabric scratched against skin that had known only the finest materials, but discomfort was a small price to pay for anonymity. 2 weeks had passed since she'd witnessed her father's murder through the study window of their Beacon Hill mansion. 2 weeks since she'd seen federal Judge Harrison Blackwood gunned down by men who'd discovered his investigation into their Boston criminal empire. 2 weeks since she'd grabbed the evidence files he'd hidden and fled into the night with nothing but the clothes on her back and her mother's jewelry sewn into her corset. The name Victoria Blackwood was probably in every newspaper from Boston to Chicago, by now, listed as either a missing person or a suspect in her father's death. But Catherine Mills, the plain spinster seeking marriage on the frontier, existed only in the forged papers she'd purchased in Denver. "Silver Peak," the driver called out. "End of the line." Victoria gathered her small carpet bag and stepped down from the coach, immediately grateful for the thin mountain air after days of travel. Around her, other passengers collected their belongings and scattered into the town like seeds on rocky soil. She was looking around for any sign of Harold Perkins, the mine supervisor, who'd answered her advertisement for correspondence and eventual marriage, when she heard a voice that made her blood freeze. "Well, I'll be damned." The voice carried a Boston accent, and Victoria felt her carefully constructed calm shatter like glass. She turned slowly to see a man watching her from the shade of the depot, overhanging his expensive suit, marking him as clearly out of place as she was trying not to be. Thomas McKinnon, one of the men who'd worked for the criminal organization her father had been investigating. Their eyes met across the small depot, and McKinnon's face split into a triumphant grin. He'd found her. Panic flooded Victoria's system like ice water. She'd been so careful, had covered her tracks so thoroughly. How had they traced her here, Miss Mills? The deep voice beside her made Victoria jump. She turned to find a tall man in a sheriff's badge, studying her with intelligent gray eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "I'm Sheriff Stone," he continued, touching the brim of his hat. "Harold Perkins sent me to meet you. He got called away on mine business, but wanted to make sure you were properly welcomed." Victoria's mind raced. This wasn't the arrangement she'd expected, but it might be the lifeline she desperately needed. Across the depot, McKinnon was starting to move toward them. "Thank you, Sheriff," she managed, trying to keep her voice steady. "I appreciate your kindness." Ethan Stone was not what Victoria had expected from a frontier lawman. He was tall and lean, with the kind of controlled strength that spoke of professional training rather than mere physical labor. His clothes were well made but not ostentatious, and there was something in his bearing that suggested education and refinement carefully disguised. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, sharp, observant, with an intelligence that seemed to catalog every detail of her appearance and demeanor. This was not a man who missed much. "Your luggage?" he asked, glancing around the depot. "Just this," Victoria replied, indicating her small bag. She'd learned to travel light since fleeing Boston. Sheriff Stone's eyebrows rose slightly at this information, but he didn't comment. Instead, he offered his arm. Shall we heralds arrange for you to stay at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house until the two of you have had a chance to get acquainted properly? As they walked away from the depot, Victoria fought the urge to look back at McKinnon. She could feel his eyes on her, could practically hear the wheels turning in his criminal mind as he planned his next move. Nervous about meeting Harold? Sheriff Stone asked conversationally as they made their way down the dusty main street. A little, Victoria admitted, which was true enough, though not for the reasons he probably assumed. He's a good man, works hard, treats his employees fairly. You could do worse for a husband in a place like Silver Peak. There was something in his tone that made Victoria glance at him sharply. Was that a warning or simple frontier pragmatism? And you, Sheriff, do you have family here? Just me, Ethan replied easily. Came to Silver Peak about 6 months ago when the previous sheriff decided he had had enough of mining town politics. 6 months. That was interesting timing, considering that was about when her father had first mentioned receiving death threats related to his investigation. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house was a neat two-story building that looked like someone's attempt to transplant Eastern respectability to the Wild West. The proprietor herself was a pleasant woman in her 50s who welcomed Victoria with the kind of genuine warmth that made her homesick for the life she'd lost. Mr. Perkins will be by for supper tomorrow, Mrs. Patterson explained as she showed Victoria to a small but clean room. He's quite eager to meet you properly, dear. As Victoria unpacked her few belongings, her mind kept returning to the problem of Thomas McKinnon. He'd found her once. He could find her again. And next time she might not have a convenient sheriff nearby to provide inadvertent protection. She needed to think, to plan. But first she needed to understand exactly what kind of man she was dealing with in Sheriff Ethan Stone. That evening, Victoria joined the other boarding house guests for dinner, a collection of miners, merchants, and travelers that represented the diverse population of Silver Peak. The conversation was lively, centered around mine production, territorial politics, and the ever-present concern about bandits in the mountain passes. Sheriff Stone was present, having been invited by Mrs. Patterson to help welcome the new arrival. He participated in the conversation with easy authority, demonstrating knowledge of both local concerns and broader territorial issues that suggested more education than his position might require. Sheriff Stone used to work for the territorial government, Mrs. Patterson explained when Victoria commented on his insights. Detective work, wasn't it, Ethan? Something like that, Ethan replied vaguely, but Victoria caught the brief tightening around his eyes that suggested the subject made him uncomfortable. Interesting, a lawman who didn't want to discuss his previous experience in law enforcement. That was worth noting. After dinner, as the other guests dispersed to their various evening activities, Ethan approached Victoria's table where she was lingering over a cup of coffee. Mind if I join you for a moment, Miss Mills? Of course not. Ethan settled into the chair across from her, and Victoria found herself under the full force of his attention. It was unsettling in a way she couldn't quite define, not threatening but incredibly thorough, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle she represented. Can I ask what brought you all the way from... He paused, consulting a piece of paper. Boston to correspond with Harold Perkins. Victoria's heart stuttered. How did he know she was from Boston? She had been careful to claim Philadelphia in her correspondence. I'm sorry, she managed. Your accent, Ethan explained with a slight smile. It's distinctly Boston Brahmin, despite your best efforts to soften it. I spent some time there a few years ago. Hard to mistake that particular way of speaking. Victoria cursed silently. She'd worked so hard to modify her speech, but apparently not hard enough to fool someone with a trained ear. My family moved to Philadelphia when I was young, she said carefully. But you're right, I was born in Boston. Beacon Hill, Ethan asked casually. The specificity of the question sent alarm bells ringing in Victoria's mind. Beacon Hill was a wealthy enclave, not the kind of place a frontier sheriff would mention, unless he had specific knowledge of Boston's social geography. Why do you ask? Just curious. You have the bearing of someone who grew up with privilege, that's all. Makes a man wonder what would drive someone from that background to seek marriage on the frontier. Victoria forced herself to meet his gaze steadily, even as her mind raced through possible responses. Sometimes people need to make new starts, Sheriff. Surely that's not unusual in a place like Silver Peak. Not unusual at all, Ethan agreed. Though it does make the man curious about what they're starting over from. The conversation was beginning to feel like an interrogation, albeit a subtle one. Victoria decided to turn the tables. And what about you, Sheriff? What brought you to Silver Peak? It's quite a change from territorial detective work. Ethan's expression didn't change, but Victoria caught the brief pause that suggested she'd touched on something sensitive. Sometimes a man gets tired of chasing other people's problems, he said finally. Local law enforcement has its own rewards. I'm sure it does, Victoria replied, though she was becoming increasingly certain that Ethan Stone was not the simple frontier sheriff he pretended to be. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a man Victoria recognized with a sinking heart, Thomas McKinnon, still in his expensive Eastern suit, looking completely out of place in the modest boarding house dining room. "Excuse me," McKinnon said in his cultured Boston accent. "I'm looking for someone who might be able to help me. I'm trying to locate a young woman who may have come through Silver Peak recently." Ethan's demeanor changed instantly, shifting from conversational to professionally alert. "What kind of business do you have with this woman?" "Family business," McKinnon replied smoothly. She's been through a terrible tragedy recently. Lost her father in a tragic accident. Her family is very concerned about her welfare." Victoria felt her blood turn to ice. McKinnon was spinning her father's murder as an accident, painting himself as a concerned family friend rather than one of the men responsible for the judge's death. "What's her name?" Ethan asked. "Victoria Blackwood. Though she might be using an assumed name, she's not quite herself right now, if you understand my meaning." The implication was clear. McKinnon was suggesting that Victoria was mentally unstable, which would explain any denial she might make about wanting to return to Boston. "Can't say I've seen anyone by that name," Ethan replied evenly. "But I'll keep an eye out. You have somewhere local you will be staying." "The hotel, I believe. Thank you for your assistance, Sheriff." As McKinnon left, Victoria struggled to control her breathing. The net was closing around her faster than she'd expected. "Friend of yours?" Ethan asked quietly, and Victoria realized he'd been watching her reaction to McKinnon's presence. "I don't believe so," she managed, though he did seem familiar somehow. Ethan studied her for a long moment, and Victoria had the unsettling feeling that he could see right through her carefully constructed facade. "Miss Mills," he said finally, "if you're in some kind of trouble, I want you to know that the law in Silver Peak exists to protect all citizens regardless of their backgrounds or circumstances." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her completely. How long had it been since someone had offered her protection without expecting something in return? "Thank you, Sheriff. That's good to know." "I mean it," Ethan said, leaning forward slightly. "If someone is threatening you, or if you're afraid of something, my job is to help. But I can only do that if you're honest with me." Victoria felt tears prick at her eyes. The temptation to tell him everything was overwhelming: the murder, the evidence, the danger she was in. But trusting the wrong person could get her killed, and she knew nothing about Ethan Stone except that he asked too many perceptive questions for a simple frontier lawman. "I appreciate your offer, Sheriff," she said carefully, "but I'm just here to meet Mr. Perkins and hopefully start a new life." Ethan nodded, but Victoria could see he wasn't convinced. "Well then, I'll let you get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a big day for you." As he rose to leave, Victoria made a decision that went against every survival instinct she'd developed. "Sheriff, yes, that man who was just here, if he comes around asking questions again, would you let me know?" Ethan's expression grew serious. "Are you afraid of him, Miss Mills?" Victoria chose her words carefully. "I think he might be the kind of man who doesn't take no for an answer." "I see." Ethan touched the brim of his hat. "In that case, you might want to know that I make rounds past this boarding house several times a night. Just part of keeping the peace in Silver Peak." After he left, Victoria sat in the quiet dining room, her mind churning with questions and possibilities. There was something about Sheriff Ethan Stone that didn't add up, something that suggested he was as much of a fraud as she was. The question was whether that made him more dangerous or less. Outside her window that night, as Victoria tried to sleep, she heard the sound of horses moving quietly through the streets. When she peered through the curtains, she could see shadows moving with purpose through the town, too organized to be random night travelers. McKinnon hadn't come alone, and whatever resources he'd brought with him suggested that the criminal organization was taking her father's stolen evidence very seriously indeed. Victoria pressed her face against the cool glass and tried to think. She was trapped in a small mountain town with nowhere to run, pursued by killers who would stop at nothing to recover what she'd taken. Her only potential ally was a sheriff who seemed to know far more about her background than any frontier lawman should. Tomorrow she would meet Harold Perkins and try to convince him to marry a woman whose real name he didn't even know. She would smile and play the part of a grateful mail-order bride while dangerous men hunted her through the streets of Silver Peak. But tonight she would try to figure out exactly what kind of man she was dealing with in Sheriff Ethan Stone. Because her life might depend on whether he was the protector he claimed to be, or just another player in a deadly game she was still learning the rules to. Victoria woke to the sound of gunshots echoing through the mountain air. She bolted upright in the narrow boarding house bed, her heart hammering, as she tried to determine how close the shots had been fired. Through her window, she could see people emerging from buildings along the main street, their faces tight with concern. In a mining town, gunfire could mean anything from claim disputes to bandit attacks, but the rapid succession of shots suggested something more serious than a simple argument. She dressed quickly, her hands shaking as she tried to fasten the buttons of her simple brown dress. Whatever was happening outside, she needed to understand whether it was connected to her presence in Silver Peak. Downstairs, the boarding house was buzzing with nervous energy. Mrs. Patterson was serving coffee to a collection of guests and neighbors who had gathered to share information and speculation about the early morning disturbance. "Happened down by the Nugget Saloon," one of the miners was saying. "Sheriff Stone and his deputy had some kind of showdown with strangers." Victoria's blood chilled. Ethan had been involved in a gunfight, and with strangers plural. "Anyone hurt?" Mrs. Patterson asked anxiously. "Don't rightly know. Saw them carrying someone to Doc Harrison's place, but couldn't tell who it was from where I was standing." Victoria excused herself and stepped out onto the front porch, scanning the street for any sign of what had transpired. Down toward the saloon, she could see a small crowd gathered in the unmistakable presence of men with badges trying to manage the situation. "Miss Mills," she turned to find Harold Perkins approaching from the direction of town, his face grave with concern. He was a pleasant-looking man in his 40s with the kind of solid reliability that had attracted her to his correspondence in the first place. "Mr. Perkins," Victoria managed, trying to shift her attention from the crisis in the street to the man she was supposed to be courting. "I was hoping to meet you under better circumstances." "Indeed, I'm afraid our quiet little town has had some excitement this morning." Harold removed his hat, revealing thinning brown hair and worried eyes. "There was some trouble with visitors from back east." Victoria's heart nearly stopped. "Visitors?" "Yes, apparently they were asking questions around town last night about someone they were looking for. Sheriff Stone seemed to think they might not have entirely honest intentions." "Do you know what happened?" Harold's expression grew troubled. "From what I heard, the strangers tried to ambush Sheriff Stone when he was making his morning rounds. They didn't count on Deputy Martinez being nearby or on the sheriff being as handy with a gun as he is." Victoria felt a mixture of relief and terror. Relief that Ethan was apparently unharmed, terror that McKinnon and his associates had moved so quickly to violence. "Was anyone hurt?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "One of the strangers was wounded, though not seriously. The others scattered when they realized they were outgunned. Sheriff Stone has the wounded man in custody." Victoria's mind raced. If McKinnon was in custody, he would eventually talk. And when he did, her carefully constructed identity as Catherine Mills would collapse like a house of cards. "Mr. Perkins," she said carefully, "I wonder if we might postpone our planned dinner this evening. I find myself feeling rather unsettled by all this violence." "Of course, my dear, though I must say you needn't worry about your safety here. Sheriff Stone is quite capable of maintaining order." If only it were that simple, Victoria thought. Her safety depended on much more than one sheriff's ability to keep the peace. As Harold excused himself to return to his duties at the mine, Victoria found herself drawn toward the scene of the morning's excitement despite every instinct screaming at her to stay away. The crowd around the Nugget Saloon was beginning to disperse, but she could see Ethan Stone standing outside the sheriff's office, deep in conversation with an older man she didn't recognize. Even at a distance, she could see the tension in Ethan's posture, the way his hand rested near his sidearm. Quite the excitement for such an early hour. Victoria turned to find a woman about her own age approaching, elegantly dressed despite the frontier setting. There was something about her bearing that suggested education and refinement qualities that seemed out of place in Silver Peak. I'm Elena Vasquez, the woman continued with a slight accent that Victoria couldn't quite place. I don't believe we've been introduced. Catherine Mills, Victoria replied automatically. I'm visiting. Elena's smile was knowing. Ah, yes, the mail-order bride everyone's talking about. How exciting for Harold Perkins. There was something in Elena's tone that suggested she knew more about Victoria's situation than casual gossip would provide. Victoria studied her more carefully, noting the expensive fabric of her dress, the cultured way she spoke. Are you from Silver Peak originally? Victoria asked. Oh no, I'm from elsewhere. Like you, I suspect. Elena's eyes sparkled with amusement. We should have tea sometime, Miss Mills. I have a feeling we might have more in common than you'd expect. Before Victoria could respond, Elena had melted back into the crowd, leaving Victoria with more questions than answers. Was everyone in Silver Peak hiding something, Miss Mills? Ethan's voice made her turn. He was approaching from the direction of his office, and Victoria could see the strain of the morning's events in his face. Sheriff Stone, she managed, I heard there was some trouble. Nothing you need to worry about, Ethan replied, but his eyes were scanning the street with professional vigilance. Though I would suggest you stay close to the boarding house for the next day or two. Was it, was it related to that man who was asking questions last night? Ethan studied her for a moment before answering. Possibly. Miss Mills, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Victoria felt her stomach drop. Of course. The man I have in custody claims to know you, says your real name is Victoria Blackwood, and that you're wanted in connection with a federal judge's death back in Boston. The words hit Victoria like physical blows. McKinnon had talked just as she'd feared. Her carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and there was nowhere left to run. She began, then stopped. What could she say? How could she explain without implicating herself further? Miss Mills or Miss Blackwood, if that's your real name, I want you to listen to me carefully. Ethan's voice was gentle but firm. I know you're in trouble. I know you're running from something. And I know that the men who are asking about you aren't the concerned family friends they claim to be. Victoria stared at him, her mind reeling. How do you know that? Because I've been tracking their organization for the better part of 2 years, Ethan said quietly. My name isn't really Ethan Stone, and I'm not really just a frontier sheriff. The admission hung between them like a bridge Victoria wasn't sure she dared to cross. Then who are you? Agent Ethan Montgomery, Pinkerton Detective Agency. And if you're really Victoria Blackwood, then you might just be the break we've been looking for in bringing down the criminal network that killed your father. Victoria felt the world tilt around her. A Pinkerton agent. No wonder he'd seemed too educated, too perceptive for a simple frontier lawman. But did that make him trustworthy or more dangerous than ever? I don't know what you're talking about, she said carefully. Ethan's expression grew patient. Victoria, I know your father was federal Judge Harrison Blackwood. I know he was investigating connections between the Boston criminal organization and territorial corruption. I know he was murdered 3 weeks ago, and that you disappeared the same night with evidence that could destroy the entire network. Victoria felt tears spring to her eyes. How do you know all that? Because I was working with him, Ethan said gently. We've been corresponding for months. He was feeding me information about the organization's western expansion, and I was tracking their operations in the territories. The revelation was so unexpected, so enormous, that Victoria felt her knees go weak. Her father had been working with a Pinkerton agent, had known that his investigation was putting him in danger. He never told me, she whispered. He was trying to protect you. We both knew that if the organization discovered our connection, anyone close to either of us would become a target. Victoria looked around the busy street, suddenly seeing Silver Peak with new eyes. You came here because of me. I came here because this is where the organization is planning to establish their next major operation. The silver mines provide perfect opportunities for money laundering and territorial influence. Ethan's voice was grim. Your showing up here was pure coincidence or maybe providence. And now we have a choice. You can keep running, keep hiding, and hope they never find you again. Or you can help me finish what your father started. Victoria felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her like a physical force. Trust this man who claimed to have worked with her father, Risk everything on his word that he was who he claimed to be. How do I know you're telling the truth? She asked. Ethan reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded letter. This is the last communication I received from your father, sent 2 days before his death. It mentions you by name and includes a message he asked me to deliver if anything happened to him. With trembling hands, Victoria unfolded the letter. The handwriting was unmistakably her father's, the content exactly what Ethan had described. And at the bottom in her father's careful script was a message that made her eyes fill with tears. Tell Victoria that her courage and intelligence are my greatest pride and that the work we do now will help ensure other daughters never face the dangers she has endured. Trust Ethan Montgomery as you would trust me. He is a good man fighting for justice. Victoria looked up to find Ethan watching her with infinite patience, waiting for her decision. The evidence I took, she said slowly. Do you know what it contains? Financial records connecting the Boston organization to territorial officials, judges, and mining operations. Names, dates, amounts. Enough to bring down the entire network if it reaches the right people in Washington. And if I help you, we use the evidence to build an airtight case. We expose the corruption, bring the murderers to justice, and make sure your father's death wasn't in vain. Victoria thought about the weeks of running, the constant fear, the loneliness of having no one to trust. Then she thought about her father's dedication to justice, his belief that the law should protect the innocent rather than serve the powerful. What do you need me to do? Ethan's relief was visible. First, we need to get you somewhere safe while I finish dealing with McKinnon and his associates. Then we need to examine the evidence you took, figure out exactly what we're working with. And the man in your custody, Trim, will be dealt with according to the law. But Victoria, I need you to understand by helping me, you're putting yourself at considerable risk. These people killed your father for less than what you're proposing to do. Victoria straightened her shoulders, calling on the same courage that had carried her across the country in search of safety. My father died trying to protect innocent people from criminals. If I can help finish that work, then the risk is worthwhile. There's one more thing, Ethan said carefully. Your cover as Catherine Mills, the mail-order bride, we need to maintain that for now. It's the only thing keeping you alive until we can move against the organization. Victoria thought about Harold Perkins, the kind mine supervisor who was looking forward to a quiet courtship with a woman who didn't exist. That seems unfair to Mr. Perkins. Harold is a good man, but he's also completely uninvolved in any of this. The less he knows, the safer he'll be. Ethan paused. Though I have to ask, were you really planning to marry him? The question was asked casually, but Victoria caught something in Ethan's tone that suggested the answer mattered to him on a personal level. I was planning to do whatever I had to do to survive, she admitted. But no, I wasn't looking forward to a marriage built on deception. Something in Ethan's expression shifted, a subtle relaxation that Victoria found herself studying with interest. Was it possible that the dedicated Pinkerton agent was developing feelings that went beyond professional concern for a witness? For now, Ethan said, you should return to the boarding house and act as normal as possible. I'll deal with the immediate threat, and then we'll figure out our next steps. As Victoria turned to go, Ethan caught her arm gently. Victoria, I know this is overwhelming, but you're not alone anymore. I give you my word that I'll protect you no matter what it takes. The sincerity in his voice made something warm unfurl in Victoria's chest. For the first time since her father's death, she felt like she had an ally, someone who understood the stakes and was willing to share the risk. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. As she walked back toward the boarding house, Victoria's mind was already working through the implications of everything Ethan had revealed. She was no longer just a woman in hiding, she was a key witness in a federal investigation with evidence that could bring down a criminal empire. It was terrifying, but for the first time in weeks, she also felt something else: hope. Her father's work would continue. Justice would be served. And maybe, just maybe, she'd found something in Silver Peak that she'd never expected to find. A chance for a future built on truth rather than deception. And a man who valued her for her courage rather than her compliance. The game was far from over, but at least now Victoria knew whose side she was really on. Victoria had been back at the boarding house for less than an hour when she heard the commotion in the street. Shouts, running footsteps, and the unmistakable sound of Mrs. Patterson crying out in alarm sent her rushing to the window. What she saw made her blood turn to ice. The boarding house was surrounded by armed men, at least 8 that she could count, positioned strategically around the building. These weren't the rough frontier types she might have expected, but professional gunmen with the kind of coordinated movements that spoke of military or law enforcement training. McKinnon must have had reinforcements waiting in the mountains, and Ethan's capture of one man had prompted them to abandon subtlety in favor of overwhelming force. "Miss Mills," Mrs. Patterson's voice carried up the stairs, high and frightened. "There are men here to see you." Victoria's mind raced through her options. The boarding house was 2 stories, but jumping from her window would likely break her legs. The evidence from her father's investigation was hidden in a secret compartment of her traveling bag, but retrieving it now would take precious time she didn't have. Heavy footsteps on the stairs told her that time had just run out. The door to her room burst open without ceremony, revealing a man Victoria didn't recognize, but whose expensive suit and cold eyes marked him as someone high in the criminal organization's hierarchy. "Miss Victoria Blackwood," he said with mock politeness. "Or should I say Miss Catherine Mills? You've led us on quite a chase." "I don't know what you're talking about," Victoria replied, calling on years of Boston social training to keep her voice steady. The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "My name is Charles Brennan. I represent certain business interests that your father interfered with before his unfortunate accident." "My father died of a heart attack," Victoria said automatically, though she knew the lie was pointless. "Did he now?" Brennan stepped into the room, and Victoria could see more armed men behind him. "That's interesting, considering Thomas McKinnon was just telling Sheriff Stone a very different story about your father's death." Victoria's heart sank. If McKinnon was talking, then Ethan's cover might be blown as well. "I'm afraid your sheriff friend has been somewhat indiscreet about his real identity," Brennan continued conversationally. "Did you know that Ethan Montgomery has been a thorn in our organization's side for nearly 2 years?" The casual revelation that Brennan knew Ethan's true identity sent panic flooding through Victoria's system. If they knew who he really was. "Where is he?" she demanded, abandoning any pretense that she didn't understand what was happening. "Safe for the moment, though his continued health depends entirely on your cooperation." Brennan moved to the window and glanced out at his positioned men. "You have something that belongs to us, Miss Blackwood. Documents that your father stole from private business correspondence." "Evidence of your criminal activities, you mean?" Brennan's smile grew colder. "Let's not get bogged down in semantics. The point is, those documents need to be returned to their rightful owners, and you're going to help us accomplish that. And if I refuse, then Agent Montgomery will discover exactly how creative my associates can be when it comes to extracting information from uncooperative law enforcement officers." Brennan's tone was conversational, which somehow made the threat more chilling. "I'm told that Pinkerton agents are particularly stubborn. It should be an interesting test of his resolve." Victoria felt sick. Whatever happened to her, she couldn't let Ethan suffer because of her father's investigation. "What do you want me to do?" "First, you're going to retrieve those documents from wherever you've hidden them. Then you're going to accompany us back east, where you'll publicly recant any accusations your father might have made about our business practices." And after that, Brennan shrugged. "After that, you'll be free to live quietly somewhere far from our operations. Perhaps Mexico. I hear the climate is lovely this time of year." The casual dismissal was clearly a lie. Victoria knew that once the organization had what they wanted, both she and Ethan would be permanently silenced. "I'll need to pack my things," she said, moving toward her traveling bag. "Of course. But please, no sudden movements. My associates are rather nervous after this morning's unpleasantness." Victoria knelt beside her bag, her fingers finding the hidden catch that opened the secret compartment. The documents were there along with some of her mother's jewelry and the small derringer her father had insisted she carry for protection. The gun was loaded, but it held only 2 shots. Against 8 armed men, it would be suicide to try fighting her way out, unless she could even the odds somehow. "Miss Blackwood," Brennan was growing impatient. "The documents." "Of course." Victoria straightened the file folder in her hands. "Though I have to say I'm curious about something." "Oh. How did you find me so quickly? I was very careful about covering my tracks." Brennan's expression grew smug. "You were indeed, but you made one crucial mistake." "Which was?" You trusted the wrong person with your real destination. Brennan gestured toward the door where another man had appeared. Allow me to reintroduce you to Harold Perkins, who has been in our employ for considerably longer than he's been corresponding with mail-order brides. Victoria felt the world tilt around her as Harold stepped into view. The kind mine supervisor, the man she'd been planning to marry for probation, was working with the criminals who had killed her father. I'm sorry, my dear, Harold said, though he didn't look particularly remorseful. But the organization pays considerably better than mining supervision, and they made me an offer I couldn't refuse. You've been watching for me all along, Victoria whispered. Ever since we learned that Judge Blackwood's daughter had disappeared with certain sensitive materials. We knew she'd eventually surface somewhere in the territories, and we made sure to have eyes in all the likely locations. The betrayal hit Victoria like a physical blow. There had never been any safety in Silver Peak, never any real chance of escape. She'd been walking into a trap from the moment she answered Harold's advertisement. Now, Brennan said, extending his hand, the documents. Victoria looked down at the file folder, then at the men surrounding her. 8 against 1, with Ethan's life hanging in the balance. There seemed to be no choice but surrender. That's when she heard it, the distinctive whistle of a silver mining canary repeated 3 times in rapid succession. It was a signal Ethan had mentioned in passing, used by miners to communicate danger in the tunnels. But they weren't in a mine, which meant the window behind Brennan exploded inward as Ethan crashed through in a shower of glass and splintered wood. He hit the floor, rolling, coming up with both guns drawn, and suddenly the odds had shifted dramatically. Nobody move! Ethan shouted, his weapons trained on Brennan and Harold. Pinkerton agents, you're all under arrest! The next few seconds were chaos. Brennan dove for cover behind Victoria's bed, shouting orders to his men. Harold fumbled for a weapon that apparently wasn't there. And Victoria, still clutching the evidence folder, found herself caught in the middle of what was rapidly becoming a gun battle. Ethan's appearance had been perfectly timed, but impossibly risky. He was still outnumbered, still fighting from a position where any stray bullet could hit Victoria. That's when she remembered the Derringer hidden in her bag. Moving faster than she'd ever moved in her life, Victoria dove toward her luggage as bullets began flying around the room. Her fingers found the small weapon just as one of Brennan's men appeared in the doorway, his gun trained on Ethan's back. Victoria didn't think. She simply raised the Derringer and fired. The shot took the gunman in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his own weapon flying. It wasn't a killing shot, but it was enough to eliminate one threat and announce to everyone in the room that Victoria Blackwood was not the helpless Eastern socialite they'd assumed. Good shot, Ethan called out, using the distraction to put another of Brennan's men out of commission. But the victory was short-lived. More armed men were thundering up the stairs, drawn by the gunfire. And Victoria's Derringer was down to 1 shot. The window? Ethan shouted, but Victoria could see that escape route was blocked by men positioned outside. They were trapped. That's when she heard something that filled her with both hope and terror, the sound of approaching horses, accompanied by the distinctive whistle signals Ethan had taught her to recognize. The cavalry was coming. But would they arrive in time? Brennan apparently had the same concern, because his demeanor shifted from confident control to desperate urgency. Kill them both, he shouted to his remaining men, and get those damn documents. The final confrontation erupted with lethal intensity. Victoria pressed herself against the wall, clutching her father's evidence, while bullets splintered wood and shattered glass around her. Ethan was magnificent in action, moving with professional precision that spoke of years of training and experience. But even the best agent couldn't be in 3 places at once, and Victoria could see that the sheer number of attackers was wearing him down. That's when the boarding house door exploded open, and Sheriff Morrison burst in with 5 deputies, their badges glinting and their weapons ready. Behind them came Elena Vasquez, the mysterious woman Victoria had met on the street, now revealed to be carrying a very professional-looking rifle. Pinkerton Agency, Morrison shouted. Everyone on the ground now. The tide of battle turned instantly. Faced with overwhelming odds, Brennan's remaining men began surrendering. Harold Perkins, who had been trying to blend into the background, found himself face down on the floor with iron shackles around his wrists. As the gun smoke cleared, Victoria found herself staring at a room full of law enforcement officers who apparently weren't who they'd pretended to be either. Agent Vasquez, Ethan said, holstering his weapons and moving to Victoria's side. Excellent timing. Agent Montgomery, Elena replied with a slight smile. I was wondering when you were going to call for backup. Victoria looked between them, her mind struggling to process yet another revelation. Agent Vasquez. Elena Vasquez, Pinkerton Detective Agency, Elena said with a slight bow. I've been working undercover in Silver Peak for 3 months, tracking the same organization that killed your father. How many of you are there? Victoria asked weakly. Enough, Ethan said, wrapping his arm around her waist in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. The Pinkerton Agency has been building a case against this criminal network for years. Your father's evidence was the final piece we needed. Charles Brennan, now in custody but still defiant, looked up from where he knelt with his hands bound. You think this is over? You have no idea how deep this organization goes, how many officials we own. Actually, Victoria said, straightening and moving away from Ethan's protective embrace. We do. She held up the evidence folder, which had somehow survived the gun battle intact. Every bribe, every corrupt official, every illegal transaction. My father documented everything, and now it's going to Washington. Brennan's face went white as he realized the full scope of what they'd lost. As the prisoners were led away and the aftermath of the battle was cleaned up, Victoria found herself alone with Ethan for the first time since the crisis began. Are you all right? He asked gently, reaching out to touch a small cut on her cheek where flying glass had nicked her. I think so, Victoria replied, though she was beginning to realize how close they'd all come to death. Ethan, when I thought they might hurt you because of me. Hey. His voice was soft as he cupped her face in his hands. We're both fine, and thanks to your courage, we have everything we need to bring down the entire organization. What happens now? Now we go to Denver, then Washington. We testify, we present the evidence, and we watch justice be served. Ethan paused. And then if you want, we figure out what comes next for us. Victoria looked into his eyes and saw something that had nothing to do with professional duty or criminal investigations. What do you want to come next? I want to court you properly, Ethan said simply. Not as a Pinkerton agent protecting a witness, not as a sheriff maintaining order. Just as Ethan Montgomery, a man who's fallen in love with the bravest woman he's ever met. Victoria felt her heart skip. And I want to be courted as Victoria Blackwood, not as Catherine Mills or any other false identity. I want to be myself finally. Then that's what we'll do, Ethan said, leaning down to kiss her gently. Though I have to warn you, dating a Pinkerton agent can be dangerous. Victoria laughed, thinking of everything they'd been through together. I think I can handle it. As they walked out of the damaged boarding house and into the Colorado sunshine, Victoria felt truly free for the first time since her father's death. The evidence would see justice done, the criminals would face trial, and she could finally stop running. But more than that, she'd found something she'd never expected to find in her desperate flight west. A man who valued her courage over her compliance, her intelligence over her inheritance. A man who wanted to build a future based on truth rather than deception. The game was finally over. And against all odds, love had won. Thank you for joining Victoria and Ethan's dangerous journey from deception to truth, from fear to courage, and from justice denied to justice served. If this story of hidden identities, deadly secrets, and the power of standing up for what's right touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more thrilling Western romances. Your support helps us bring you these tales of strong heroines and the heroes who fight alongside them. What did you think of the Pinkerton Agency twist and Victoria's brave choice to fight back? Share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, may you find the courage to stand for justice and the love that stands with you.